I'm Dave Isaac, an editor here at Gregory FCA and a former journalist. And today I'm speaking with Paul Lim, Senior Vice President at BackBay Communications, a Gregory FCA company. And Paul's a former journalist himself. I'm going to pick his brain on what life was like on the other side of the communications fence and how it's influenced his job now in public relations. Paul, thanks for being with me.
Thanks, Dave. Nice to be here.
So before we get into the PR side of things, how did you get into journalism? What was that career chapter like for you?
Yeah, I kind of backed into journalism. I worked at my student newspaper like a lot of people who have no intention of ever going into journalism. And my intent was really to go to move to Washington at some point to work in some policy capacity. So I had started or was about to start a master's program in government administration. And about 2 weeks before I started that program, I just kind of incidentally ran into a person who was doing some recruiting for a newspaper in the same city that the master's program was at. And they had just started what was at that point somewhat new. Now it's, every newspaper in the country offers them, but they're essentially kind of year-round internships. And he had said that, hey, if you want to do this, we can set you up in a year-round job at the paper on an internship that lasts for 2 years that coincides with the master's program, and they could tailor the hours to work for me. So I ended up doing both. And at the end of 2 years, I didn't really want to go into government work. And the only skill set I had was the newspaper internship. So my first full-time job out of that was working for a newspaper. I moved to Seattle at that point and started a job at the Seattle Times as a business reporter.
So you turned into an ink-stained wretch, and you're in finance. What does a day in the life of a finance reporter look like?
It really runs the gamut because there are quiet days, there are busy days, but oftentimes you end up coming into the morning thinking you're going to cover A, B, and C, and within 5 or 10 minutes of you stepping in, you realize that the events of the day have changed and you're covering X, Y, and Z. And it's kind of being able to adjust on the fly and pivot a lot, and coming up to speed as quickly as you can on a subject that you frankly may not have had much experience or any experience covering. So even though we were all business reporters, there were industries we never covered, there were topics we never covered. We kind of had to learn on the fly.
So even though broadly you're covering finance, you're almost a general assignment reporter in a way, in that you kind of need to leverage some experts to write authoritatively on those topics.
Yeah, exactly. And I would say even, so I started off being more of a general business reporter, but then as my career went along, I became much more kind of specialized. I covered the financial markets. I did a lot of work in kind of personal finance and wealth management topics. But even once you start in that beat, as it were, there are always topics within the beat that you don't know. When I did a lot of personal finance coverage, I knew a lot about investing and I knew about retirement planning, and those were subject areas I was grounded in, but I didn't know a lot about other things. There were a lot of estate planning and tax planning issues that, you really had to go seek experts to come up to speed on.
So in terms of finding those sources and the expertise there, what was your relationship with PR like? How would people pitch you? What made for a good pitch when you're a finance reporter?
You get dozens and dozens of pitches all day long. And 90% of them were off topic. They weren't necessarily things that were usable. Maybe 5% were things that could work for you for that particular story or that particular day, and you took advantage of those. And then the other 5%, I'd say, were really kind of pitches that weren't bad, but they just weren't, the timing wasn't working out. So you would kind of, we would collect string. We would take that idea and kind of stash it away in our inboxes, in our to-do list, and we would come back to those pitches, not necessarily tomorrow, but maybe a week or a month from now. So I would consider those successful pitches. They just weren't, and so much of life is timing. And sometimes you could have the greatest pitch in the world, but if the timing isn't right, you can, it has legs, it has the ability to be useful, down the road in a way that perhaps, even the person who was doing the pitching wasn't thinking about.
Sure. So even somebody who's in PR that doesn't have that reporter's background is aware that your inbox is going to be flooded. Is there a particularly creative pitch that found your inbox over the years that you kind of think back to and remember?
No, I think 99% of the time, I would say that the best pitches are the ones that offer you not just the thought leader, but offer you the thought that they bullet out kind of, hey, this person on this particular issue can talk about these points and this is their point of view. It lays it out so that you know exactly how you might use it in a story. But oftentimes we get like great pitches like that, a dozen times over in a day. And sometimes the pitches that stand out to me are the ones that almost counter program. After you see a series of like paragraph and paragraph long pitches from people, sometimes your eyes need a rest. It's kind of like how you put together a magazine. You need long stories and you need short little bites. And sometimes the short bites are the ones that come through. The pitch that the types of pitches that stand out to me after getting so many of those very, very detailed pitches are the ones that say, hey, so-and-so's in town, you want to grab a drink? And I don't have to think about it. It's, they're not pushing a story on me. And that kind of works, but it only works if the person who's putting that pitch out has a relationship with the reporter. That person I know, I've worked with that person on different stories, and I know that the type of people they bring to me are useful in my articles. And they're not trying to kind of jam a point of view that I might not otherwise want to take. And, it creates much more of a helpful relationship building kind of environment.
Sure. That makes sense. And something to kind of stick in the back of your mind as you progress through a journalism career, which you spent time at a bunch of different publications. Is there a different barrier to entry at, say, a trade publication versus the New York Times?
Well, I think it oddly enough, the type of specificity that a lot of like the clients that we work for and that PR people kind of work for, the type of specificity they bring to the table lends itself to a lot of those trade publications because the readership of those publications is so tailored that they understand exactly whether it's a piece of legislation or whether it's a particular kind of industry trend that they need to tackle. When you get to kind of like the higher tier publications that are more general interest, that yes, they've got decision makers reading them, but they also have other people reading them who aren't necessarily decision makers. They have to be a little broader in their take. So I think in an odd sort of way, being too specific may be a little difficult to kind of sell to a New York Times, but it's a lot easier to sell to, like PEI or wealthmanagement.com or places like that.
Sure. So I guess if you have something good to offer, you can find a home for it somewhere.
Yeah, there's always a place for it. And you just have to, you kind of have to understand who the audience is and you have to understand who the reporter is. One of the things that I found when I was a reporter was that, oftentimes people referred to me as an investing reporter because I covered a lot of investing topics, but there are like 5 or 6 different types of investing reporters. There's an investing reporter who covers things from a personal finance bent, which was much more like me. There are personal finance reporters who cover kind of topics from what I would call the bottom up, that they cover companies, and in covering companies, they then talk about trends. Then there are kind of top-down investing reporters who cover like larger investing trends, kind of things that perhaps a strategist might be more concerned about, but an everyday reader may not. And then, because there are so many different types of people who all get described as investing reporters, the person who makes those pitches, they really got to know that reporter is this type of investing reporter, and that type of report, this other reporter is this other type of reporter. And it makes the pitching a lot more effective. And it makes sure that they know that the reporters know that the person who's doing the pitching knows who they're talking to.
Sure. Now, how did your career transition over to the PR world? Because that's not always the smoothest for everybody. How was it for you?
For me, it was actually a pretty seamless transition. When I first moved, I knew that my career was in journalism was a bit over, and I was under a very different circumstance than a lot of folks. When my last job in journalism was as the deputy managing editor at Money Magazine, and that was a former Time Inc. publication based in New York. I'd been living in Boston and kind of shuttling back and forth, and in my case, Money Magazine and all of the Time Inc. publications had gone through so many transitions of corporate ownership. When I joined as an editor at Money, we were part of Time Warner. It got spun off to Time Inc. as a separate publicly traded company. Time Inc. got sold to Meredith Corporation, which was another publicly traded company. Meredith Corporation then turned around and said, "Hey, we're going to sell some of the titles individually." So that was, Money, Time, Fortune, and Sports Illustrated. So they kind of let us know that, hey, certainly your job is still there if you want it, but please keep in mind that the ownership structure is going to change again. And after so many of those ownership structure changes, I kind of decided that I need to look for something that's probably going to be easier to find here in Boston. And I had gotten into conversations with my bosses here, and we spent about a year kind of talking about the nature of the job and the transition. And once I kind of came here, I found that functionally it was a lot. There were a lot of similarities between what I was doing in journalism and what I'm doing here. There's a lot of writing. There's a lot of kind of idea gathering. There's a lot of keeping up with the news and figuring out what's new and what's already been covered. So, functionally, I think the job ended up being very similar to what I was doing as a journalist, with the exception of not seeing my byline out there.
Sure. I think that broadly there's a misconception that if you're in PR and you have connections with reporters, that's the missing link. But we on this PR side, we have to do a lot more work than that. We can't just call up our buddies and say, "Hey, I've got a story for you. Will you talk to this person?" What have you found to be the most impactful, whether it's a skill or a trait or whatever, that has transitioned with you from journalism over to PR that's helped you and helped your clients?
The biggest skill set is really kind of going back to that thing we talked about before, timing. That, showing up is like 80-90% of the battle. I think, you talked about a misconception. There is a misconception, I think, among kind of folks who want to be quoted by reporters, folks who want to speak to reporters, that these reporters kind of have the story laid out in their heads and they know exactly what they want to talk about and they know exactly who they want to talk to. They don't. A lot of these stories are kind of created on the fly. They're created last minute and you are scrambling. And when you're scrambling, you can't necessarily get the person who would ideally be the greatest person to quote for this story on the phone in time to make your deadline. So you have to kind of pivot and redeploy your resources, in many cases within the construct of a single day or two. And you've got to look for other people who can speak to kind of ideas that you want to introduce in that story. And the people I quoted oftentimes were the ones who were willing to speak to me as a reporter while they were in a cab heading to someplace they need to be, or who were, who had maybe 30 minutes of downtime while they're waiting for a flight at JFK. And they're saying, "Hey, I'll take your call and I'll give you my thoughts." And, those folks kind of when you're able to pick up the phone and speak to the reporter, on such short notice without prep time and all of that, the reporter really understands that, you did them a favor, that you're dependable, that if they need to speak with you, you are willing to, if you can, jump on the phone. And that builds a lot of goodwill for reporters. Oftentimes I would go, that person who would call me from the airport, I would call them back. I've had people call me from vacations, while they're while they're reading a book on the beach, and they said, "Hey, I've got like 15 minutes to kill. Like, I'm happy to answer your questions." And those are the people who, build up a lot of goodwill with reporters. And those reporters will call those people back, under normal circumstances, under normal office hours, for months and years to come. So I think that, that's really part of relationship building, being willing to show up.
Sure. Last one for you, Paul, because that's some great insight. Is there a misconception maybe from the other side, something that you wish reporters knew about the PR side, now that you've been on both sides of the fence, you know, and maybe they don't?
Well, I think reporters need to know that that the folks who they're they're being pitched by, the PR folks, they've got a particular client base or a particular expert they're dealing with, and they've got a point of view, and that person who they're trying to introduce to the reporter doesn't necessarily have to be expert on the entirety of the story. As a reporter, we're in some stories, we're speaking to dozens of people. If it's a daily story, we may be speaking to 6, 7, 8 people. And given that you're speaking to so many different people, you really only need to have that expert speak to to that aspect of the story that they're really passionate about, that they really have an understanding of, and that their understanding might be particularly unique. So I think the one thing that reporters need to be aware of is, hey, that person is coming to me under the auspices of this particular experience set or skill set, and they could speak to me about this part of my story. And I don't need them to be the perfect person who also understands the other, 3/4 of the story. They can just be that person who fills this bucket of that story, and that's perfectly fine. And in fact, as a reporter, I like that a lot more. That you would, it's great to find a source who can speak to all elements of the story, but you can really only quote them on a couple elements at most, right? If you turn in a story where that same person is quoted like 7 times in the article, your editor is going to ask you questions. So, there's a preference to having somebody whose point of view is so targeted that, when you sit down to write the story, I've got to include that person's quote in that part of the story, because they are either so expert in it or they're so passionate about it that I know that they're going to be the person who's going to be the spokesperson for that element of the story.
Sure. Well, Paul, I really want to thank you for your time. This has been great. Some excellent kind of inside baseball on how both of these two industries kind of work independently and together. And I think our viewers learned a lot, and I did as well. So really appreciate you making some time for us.
Oh, I appreciate your thoughtful questions, Dave.